Hello, I'm Trooper Anthony Califano at the Washington State Patrol, and this Target Zero update is all about impaired driving. You already know that impaired driving is the leading factor in fatal crashes in Washington. That's not new. Impaired driving has been around almost as long as we've had cars. The first impaired driving arrest happened in 1897 after a 25-year-old London cab driver crashed his cab into a building. By 1910, the first DUI laws went into effect in the United States. Early DUI laws didn't include BAC limits, as there was no practical way to measure the alcohol level of an impaired driver. New Year's Eve of 1938 marked the first real-world use of a breath alcohol measuring device, the drunkometer. By 1949, Washington had a per se limit of 0.15. The BAC limit was lowered to 0.10 in 1969 and then to 0.08 in 1999. In 2018, Utah became the first state to implement a 0.05 per se limit, and since then, several other states, including Washington, have proposed bills that would lower their state per se limit to 0.05. Historically, most DUI fatalities involved a driver who tested positive for a single substance, but in the past decade, we've seen a shift. By 2013, poly-drug drivers were the most common type of impaired driver in fatal crashes. The gap continues to widen, and in 2020, poly-drug drivers involved in fatal crashes were more than double the drivers impaired by alcohol or one other drug. The most common poly-drug combination, as you might guess, is alcohol and cannabis. Cannabis-involved fatal crashes nearly doubled in 2014, the same year that recreational cannabis was legally available in Washington. In 2021, impairment was a factor in 61% of all traffic fatalities in Washington. That translates to 412 lives lost, but not all those fatalities can be attributed to drivers. 86 impaired pedestrians and cyclists were killed in traffic crashes. Whatever the mode of transportation, impairment is a major risk factor, but impaired driving remains the greatest risk to not only the impaired driver, but also other road users. Impaired driving transcends all demographics, but there are some trends. About 3/4 of all impaired drivers involved in a fatal crash are male. Younger drivers, aged 21 to 25, are the most represented, and frequency declines with age. Despite impairment being the top factor in fatal crashes, the vast majority of Washington drivers don't drive impaired. 78% of Washington drivers never drive within 2 hours of consuming alcohol, and 85% never drive within 2 hours of consuming cannabis. Less than 2% of drivers in Washington have a BAC of 0.05 or greater. Cultural attitudes are predominantly opposed to driving impaired. 83% of Washington drivers believe that it is unacceptable to drive after consuming alcohol or cannabis. Intervention is also a value in Washington. 80% of people, when faced with a situation where someone might drive impaired, intervene to provide a safe alternative to driving. When it comes to impaired driving, the core values of our communities align with our law enforcement priorities. When we focus our enforcement on impaired drivers, we're engaging in a proven strategy for reducing impaired driving and saving lives.